But my topic is called resisting heteronormativity and resisting recolonization. And I'm very interested in indigenous women's affective bonds in southern Africa and how these really haven't been picked up by sort of conservative nationalist groups that are trying to say that homosexuality is foreign to African culture and so on. But I wanted to contextualize. I mean, I worked on this when I was working on a book that I published in 2006 called Imperialism Within the Margins, Queer Representation and the Politics of Culture in Southern Africa. And I was very interested in examining the political shift that happened in South Africa from apartheid to democracy, and what this shift meant for the politics of sexuality in South Africa and in the neighboring region, and what it continues to mean in this transitional phase that's ongoing. Now, of course, what happened was that juridically, everything became sort of deracialized. There was a huge shift, in government structures and social structures, political structures, and so on, not just based on race, but on all kinds of equality across the board. A new constitution, one of the first in the world, that has a clause prohibiting discrimination according to sexual orientation, and so on. So the juridical practices changed, but material practices or material conditions lag behind. So there's always a gap. I mean, those juridical changes are necessary, but they're not sufficient in themselves, because, of course, when people have been trained to think and see the world in black and white, you can't simply overnight say, okay, new constitution, so, we have to start thinking differently. I mean, it takes, it's taken a very long time. And even for sexuality in the Constitution, I mean, a drag queen in Cape Town told me when I was doing my research, well, if some homophobe sticks a knife in my throat, what am I supposed to do? Throw the Constitution in his face and say, excuse me, but you can't do that, So, I mean, we have to look at this ongoing gap between juridical, what's institutionally prescribed, and what actually happens. But I investigated sort of textual and cultural representations of same-sex desire to consider the ways in which so-called queer cultural productions outside of the West don't always intersect with Western identity politics, but often resist them. And this was very important, too, because in South Africa, it just wasn't about claiming or coming out or being visible or coming out as gay or lesbian or whatever. It was more resistance to the legacy of fixed identities that was very stringently imposed by apartheid. So it comes out of post-apartheid politics. Apartheid, I mean, you had to carry an identity card, with your race on it, and of course, there was some weird formula if your maternal grandmother was, had black blood or something that, but of course, across the board, it was a resistance. It was a very exciting time. I mean, especially I started this research in 1994, 1996, which was just 2 years after the election for Nelson Mandela. So, I mean, there was sort of, change in the air. Now, of course, things are happening, things are a bit different, because of HIV/AIDS and all kinds of other things. But I was very interested in the difference between sort of queer cultural practices and sort of the, queer as connected very much to the context of post-apartheid politics. This involves, I think, a radical rethinking of center and periphery relations and a queering of social and not just sexual space, to the extent that peripheries, or margins, whatever you want to call them, are not simply the binary opposites of Western metropolitan centers of power, but these peripheries can contain new or quite possibly similar forms of hegemonic power within them. So we have to look at that, and we also have to see that these so-called marginal spaces can have sites of supplementarity or sites of difference that cannot be contained in the standard center-periphery or global north, global south split. So we have to sort of look a little bit more reflectively about what doesn't fit. Where are the gaps? Where are the spaces? Where because we can't, our categories, are sometimes very problematic. I was very interested in how post-colonial nationalism appears to be very radical, especially right after colonial power. We want to be more radical. Colonialism taught us to sort of have this inferiority complex about ourselves, that we have to, what the effects of colonialism was that colonized people saw themselves as subordinated to Europe. And it takes a long time to sort of work, to work through that. So that was very radical about nationalism, trying to reclaim our language and our cultural traditions, which were taken from us. But at the same time, nationalism slides from being a strategy of opposition to being one of oppression. You know, because then when you have a new notion of what the nation means, then you have a new center. And see, then the whole center and periphery thing splits, you know, because then certain people, certain linguistic groups, certain ethnic groups, certain sexualities, and so on don't fit. So a new form of hegemonic power somehow, you know, arises. Now, sexuality as an intellectual lens, not just as a form of, you know, sex or related to bodies or a practice or whatever, but sexuality as an intellectual lens for new thinking about challenging gender and sexual norms in development work, I think is quite important. One finding of my book was that same-sex affective and sexual bonds between Basotho women and Lesotho start off in adolescence, and they often continue alongside heterosexual marriage, and they even involve a genital relation, you know, a sexual relationship as well. Not always, but they just continue right along and these are accepted ways for young girls to sort of become part of the social structure. Now, I've written on this for a forthcoming paper in the journal Feminist Review as a way of developing a comparative feminist scholarship that will allow us to expose and make visible various overlapping forms of subjugation in women's lives, taking into account the differences of post-colonial and indigenous feminist history. But in order to do this, we need to look at gender as shaped by and determinant of specific historical, cultural, and ideological conditions, being careful not to overuse global, as in global feminism, which may collapse into Western, and elide local conditions and contexts outside of the Euro-American axis. In other words, we need to ask global according to whom. We have to be sort of careful how we use that term as well. Who produces knowledge about formerly colonized people, and what are the political stakes in that production? Now, in order to understand the connections of gender, oppression, and poverty, it's important not to reduce gender to notions of universal female subordination, but to look at how gender is constructed and operates within very specific historical and cultural contexts. In the post-colonial world, I think this means looking at gender as discursively enfolded into imperial power and its ongoing legacy. Achille Mbembe, in his book On the Post-Colony, writes, quote, "During the colonial era and its aftermath, phallic domination has been all the more strategic in power relationships, not only because it's based on the mobilization of the subjective foundations of masculinity and femininity, but also because it has a direct, close connection with the general economy of sexuality, so that they are very much linked. Not only is male domination derived, quote, from the individual male's ability to demonstrate his virility at the expense of the woman and to obtain his validation from the subjugated woman herself, end quote, but in addition to that, imperial relations of rule have been based on the construction of the subaltern other as feminine, as a way of marking power relations between Europe and its colonies. So as a metaphor, you know, notions of gender and sexuality and sort of the implied notion that colonized men are not real men, you know, and have therefore been subjugated and castrated through the colonial process, raises questions that I think help us to understand some of the resistances to homosexuality as being, you know, un-African and, you know, all of that. Not that that excuses it, but I think we have to sort of try to, you know, look at the reasons behind it. Now, another and a final significant difference is to think especially about gender and sexuality as linked axes of analysis in ways that have been historically elided in the West. When Judith Butler says that sexuality is regulated in culture through the policing and the shaming of gender, this often rings with hyperbolic effect in post-colonial contexts, since post-colonial nation-states often attempt to naturalize gender roles for women and men by conflating heteronormativity, that's marriage, reproduction, etc., with proper gender and loyal citizenship, thereby undermining women's and often men's erotic autonomy, and at the same time erasing the histories of indigenous, counter-hegemonic, non-heteronormative sexualities that existed before colonial rule. Anyway, I mean, these were erased under colonial rule, and there still, you know, are attempts to, you know, to sort of suppress them. Yet while various strands of African cultural nationalism have claimed that homosexuality is a form of Western decadence, same-sex bonds between women in Africa have always existed, but they have not necessarily existed as the forms of sexual identity we understand in the West. That is, these may be more performative than discursive. They may be more, you know, actually not about claiming an identity, but they may be more about the performativity. This raises all kinds of questions about Foucault, who said that there was this huge shift in the 19th century from sexuality as practices, or, you know, acts, to an identity, to, you know, and of course I think his history of sexuality is very much a history of Western sexuality.